welcome to Stork'd, the podcast. This is your host, Julia Carroll, and I am so excited to introduce our next guest, Ruby Warrington. Ruby has just written the book, Women Without Kids. And what I love so much about Ruby is that she is really willing to go deep and dive into her own knowing, her self-wisdom, her authenticity, and it's that introspection that she pairs with research and data and storytelling to share with us what it's like to choose not to have kids and why so many people are choosing that path. I really value that Ruby has chosen to put her truth out there so boldly and to proclaim it so loudly so that others can see themselves reflected in her. The ability to choose not to have kids, it's amazing. One of the things we talk about in this episode, and I think it's really interesting and special, and I feel like even though my choice was very different from Ruby's, I chose very much to have a kid, no matter the circumstances. Many of my choices I felt the similar tension. And the tension is this. Ruby describes this deep knowing, his certainty in her core, in her gut, that having kids wasn't for her. And she can stand in that authentic truth and she can say, yes, this is who I am. This is what I wanted. She can also identify that she had trepidation and she was not super confident in that because there's this sense that when you're going against the grain, when you're doing something that is unusual or you haven't seen reflected by many other people, you get this questioning of like, is there something wrong with me? Even though I know it's the right thing for me, why is it the right thing for me? Is there something that's not quite right? And Ruby explores both the confidence and certainty and the shame and sits in the both and. And I think that's really special. How many decisions, whether it's to be with a partner that you think you're supposed to be with, or to go to a school that you think you're supposed to go to, or to not take the job that you think other people want you to take, or whatever the major life decision is, when you feel like you're going against the grain, even if you know it's the right choice for you, it can feel uncomfortable. And I love that Ruby was able to say both of those truths out loud in this podcast episode. So one thing that's exciting is that Ruby's book comes out next week, guys. It comes out on March 28th. And if you pre-order the book on her website, she has this free gift. And that gift is sort of like a guide to the book that can help with book clubs and your own introspection, etc. I highly recommend doing that. So if you're listening to this before the book launches on March 28th, highly recommend that you get the free resource. I also encourage you to share the book and this episode with friends because you never know who might be quietly delving into their own psyche and saying, I don't know about this kid thing. So here's Ruby. As always, if you love Stork'd, share it with a friend, write a review, follow us on social media, and follow the newsletter. We have awesome content.
Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. And guys, I am so excited to introduce Ruby Warrington to us today. You're going to hear about all the many wonderful things that she does, but she's really recently written a book, and I think it's just so perfect for us to talk about. Ruby, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Julia. Hi, listeners. Thanks for having me. I'm a writer. I've been a journalist. I write books. I edit books. I've done copywriting. Words are my thing. I'm a writer. I'm from the UK originally, and I've been in the US for a little over 10 years now. Yeah, it's funny that what comes up when you ask me to describe myself is everything about my career, right? Because that's been so much the focus of my life.
One of the things you do to describe yourself is I've seen written that you call yourself a book doula, or you help people birth books. What does that mean in the context of giving life to something?
Right. Well, I think I first learned about the term doula about 5 or 6 years ago. A really good friend of mine in Brooklyn, she actually lived above a natural birthing, like a doula center. And she would talk to me all the time about what happened there. And I just thought it was a very interesting concept. And I started working with authors and writers at all sorts of different stages in their book birthing processes about 4 or 5 years ago, whether it was helping someone concept the idea for a book, really hone their focus, come up with a structure, whether they were writing a book proposal or even creating a whole manuscript and wanting someone to kind of like be their coach throughout that. And it's kind of a massive cliche to talk about books as being our book babies. But I do think there are some similarities in the process of this is something that is often very, very personal. It's sort of born from within us. An idea sort of plants its seed in us somehow. And then there's a compulsion to kind of birth this thing into the world. And it can be a very lengthy process too. And so I work with people very, very closely one-to-one throughout this process. And it's incredibly intimate and very personal and very in-depth and hugely satisfying for all parties involved. And at the end of it, we birth a beautiful book into the world. So that was where I came up with the term book doula. And doula, I think the term I've looked into, the term actually originates, I think it Dana Raphael coined the term in the 70s. And it literally just means servant of women. And so I've actually only worked with one man, one sort of masculine person in this process. But yeah.
I love that. I love it on like so many levels. One is this podcast is all about the creative process when it comes to building your families. And I think we get stuck in this myopic perspective that your families have to include kids, they have to include a partner, they have to look a certain way. Sometimes that they have to have biological kids even. And we're here to try and expand that. We're here to try and blow that concept wide open, which is why you're here today and talk to us about your particular book. And so I think thinking about books or our passions or something that we're giving to the world as our babies is equally as important as thinking about genetic babies or biological babies or babies that we nurture and care for. How does that resonate with you?
Well, it's interesting. I think the reason I think people do draw comparisons or talk about book babies is that they are, like I said, so personal and so emotionally connected. We're so emotionally connected to the books that we write. They really do feel like a part of us, especially if we're writing about more personal subjects. And they're the kinds of books that I tend to work on with people. A lot of my coaching sessions feel like therapy. I'm going deep into their motivations, into their family dynamics, like all of the things that are part and parcel of telling your story and putting it into the world in a way that feels resonant and helpful for people. But I remember the first time I kind of described one of my books as a baby to my mom. The look of horror on her face was just a reminder that, a book it's not a life and death situation. Nobody is going to come to any great harm if a book project gets abandoned halfway through the process. And so as much as I like the analogy, I also am very acknowledging of the fact that there's still a lot of differences there between a book and a baby.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Also, we need to give equal weight to those things that are personally really important to us, whether that's the writing creative process, whether that's having and raising children, whether that's something else in our professional lives. So Ruby, we've been talking about this gestation period, the sense of creating life through giving birth to your ideas. And you are just at the point of launching into the world your newest baby. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Oh, goodness. Women Without Kids has been gestating for about 2.5 years at this point. And gearing up, the due date is coming close, and I'm feeling swollen with all of the feelings and all of the vulnerability and all of the, have I got what it takes? Can I really do this? Against a backdrop of quite a politically charged conversation around this subject matter. So I have some trepidation around it. But the ultimate aim is twofold. I think first and foremost, it's to really help valorize the path of non-motherhood and to make the case that it is as normal not to be a mother as it is to be a mother at this point in our evolutionary trajectory. And secondly, I really want to help women without kids find one another and to find solidarity on what can be a very lonely and very othered path.
I resonate with that so much. I think normalizing whatever your family life is, particularly those that have historically been so charged, such as choosing not to have kids, is so important. Thank you so much for creating this for us. But it's interesting because my path is to become a solo mom by choice. And so many of the people on that similar path have a conversation or have articulated similarly that they, like me, focused on career first, right? They were so focused on the next achievement and what it takes that you get your head down and you get just like goal oriented to such a point that you raise your head up at one point and realize, oh my God, my fertility is nearing the end. And if I want to do this, I either have to find a partner really, really quickly or I need to do it on my own. And so it does start to feel like there's a push-pull between career and having kids. And it's this unfair binary construct, which I don't know. I'm struggling to articulate the question because it's not binary, and you can choose anything along the spectrum of any, all, both, neither.
Yeah. And this is something I did dive into really in depth in Women Without Kids. You mentioned this idea of a spectrum, and I think that applies to kind of almost every aspect of our lives, and not least to our capacity for caregiving and creativity and just the energy and other resources that we have at our disposal in order to be able to juggle potentially multiple kind of commitments. A career, a thriving career, particularly if you are doing something that's maybe more self-directed, and a child, are obviously huge commitments in terms of time, energy, resource. And so I think oftentimes I've heard women be criticized for kind of, oh, you shouldn't have left it so late. Didn't you realize time was ticking? And it's like, well, no, it's actually just really, really, really challenging to do both. And the point that I make in my book is that for many of us, we don't already have an option not to pursue career first if we want to create some kind of financial stability for ourselves. And that takes pretty much everything that a lot of us have got. Yeah. And the thought of being able to raise a child in addition to be able to create our own financial stability, which was ultimately the kind of like feminist dream of the 70s, like second wave feminist movement, was that women would be able to have our own financial stability so that we weren't dependent on men for a material, safety ultimately in the world. That making that for ourselves, creating that for ourselves is for most people a full-time commitment. There are so many women who do it all. And I've spent so much of my life just feeling so weak and pathetic for knowing that I couldn't do that. And yet part of one of the reasons I wanted to write this book and dive into that subject in particular was just to go, it doesn't make me weak and pathetic. It just means I have different capacities. I have different resources available to me, and I've made the best choices for me and my well-being along the way, even down to the fact that I'm mega, mega introverted. So I have a limited battery in terms of how much people time I have in each day. So the thought of like having small people who are entirely dependent on me at the end of a busy work day, I just know that mentally, emotionally, I couldn't do that. So it's down to those little nuances of just like really knowing myself, my capabilities, my inadequacies. What am I good at? What am I not good at? And making my decisions and coming to terms with and accepting the consequences of those decisions based on this kind of larger idea of like self-acceptance. What am I actually available for? What am I good at? What do I want to do with my life? What am I not going to be able to do? Can I make my peace with that? Weighing up all of these kind of insights and then kind of, mapping that against my circumstances, if that makes sense.
It makes so much sense. I mean, anything in life is a trade-off. And in particular, our family lives are trade-offs. We are given certain things that are within and outside of our control. We make trade-offs within the context of what we're given. So for instance, some of us want kids and never meet a partner like me or the right partner for having kids, or some of them are focused on our career and we don't have the financial ability to give up the career in order to have kids. And there's a lot of data out there around how putting your career on hold, even for a couple of months to have a baby, that can set you back financially. It sets your savings back. It sets your career prospects back. I mean, and some of these things never get righted on track again, that you are permanently at a disadvantage relative to your male peers if you choose to do that. Some of us go through infertility journeys. Nobody wants to go through infertility and have your body not behave in the way that you expect. And so then what? Then there are the trade-offs. And so we're talking hypothetically here, or it's not even hypothetically, we're talking sort of conceptually. And that's in part because you've just written this wonderful book about not having kids, about having a child-free life. And you're speaking to it with a lot of introspection. Can we go back to the beginning? Can you tell me a little bit about when did the initial thoughts that this might not be something you wanted, or that the path for you was child-free, when did that initially germinate for you? Were you a small child? Was it later in life?
Well, I write in the book about a conversation I remember having with my mother when I was probably about 5 years old, which was probably the first clue, although it wasn't something I was cognitively like aware of what I was saying or what I was feeling at the time, obviously at age 5. But I remember asking her why people found babies so cute. I couldn't understand why people seemed so obsessed with babies and got so excited about babies and wanted to hold babies and snuggle with babies. It wasn't something that appealed to me. And I was very genuinely confused as a small child as to why human babies were really largely very ugly, I thought.
Yeah.
Compared to animal babies, which were so cute. Kittens and puppies and baby chicks were so cute and fluffy and appealing. Baby humans were very unappealing to me.
They're a little gremlin-y.
They're a little gremlin-y and wrinkly, and they smelled bad and they cried all the time, and they just seemed very unappealing objects to have around. And I don't know if this, like, retrospectively, my brother was born when I was like 3.5, and he had some serious health issues when he was a small baby, and was also a very kind of fractious child. Like, he never slept through the night, a lot of problems feeding. It was just very challenging. He's absolutely one of my most favorite people. But yeah, I think that his arrival in our household was very disruptive, and perhaps my observation then was kind of like a reflection on that. But and it wasn't something I became very consciously aware of until I guess I reached sort of my teens and started having sex education classes where the emphasis was very much on like sex for women was about pregnancy and childbirth. And these are the things that we had to be concerned with if we were going to be sexually active. And so I guess, yeah, I never felt excited about becoming a mother, but I wasn't actively staking out a child-free future for myself. I suppose my attitude was, it'll probably just happen at some point. I just figured it would just happen because that's just what women do. That's just what happens for women. Yeah. And so then there were a couple of stake in the ground moments. I did unexpectedly become pregnant at 23 and opted to have an abortion. So that was a real kind of like a real confronted. But again, even then it was like a definitely not now. Definitely not now.
But maybe sometime in the future.
But maybe sometime in the future. I got married when I was 27 at the same age as my best friend at the time. And I remember she sort of immediately being very excited after she had got married that they were going to be starting to try for a family straight away. And I was like, we're definitely not. And she seemed very upset with me. And that was a moment where I was like, okay, our goals are definitely not aligned here. And I was curious. I couldn't feel her excitement. I didn't feel any excitement around the idea.
It's interesting that there's this like sisterhood that's forged from having babies together.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Like, what is it about this? Oh, we're going to have our babies together, that so many friends or siblings or others celebrate. And it kind of, to me, sparks this question about, can you have that sisterhood with people that you love without the shared experience of having kids together?
Well, I think that stems from the fact that this is probably one of the most life-changing transformational experiences that a person can go through, can experience. And so the thought of doing that with someone you feel close to is exciting. So I think that's a very natural kind of urge. And then perhaps underneath that, there's a subconscious understanding that I'll need support and I'll be needing solidarity with people who are experiencing the same things as me. But yeah, that was definitely, and I wouldn't say it was a rupture in our friendship, actually, not in an overt way. And we'd already had some friendship difficulties prior to that due to kind of other stuff. But But yeah, our lives have gone very, very different directions since then. We're still in touch. And when we do hang out, we have a great time, but we've led completely different lives in many ways. And I think then I sort of had the age 30 in my mind as when it would kick in, when this desire would kick in. I was still expecting it to kick in at some point because it just seemed like
it'll just hit like a bolt of lightning.
Biologically, this is what I'm supposed to do. And so my mom had been just like 29, 30 when she had me. And so I just sort of thought, well, that's probably the age that I'll start wanting a child. But I didn't. And then 35 passed, and then I got towards the end of my 30s. And yeah, it wasn't that I didn't ever question it. Throughout my 30s, I questioned it. I was sort of on tenterhooks, like waiting for this urge to kind of kick in, waiting for it, and becoming increasingly, I suppose, I wouldn't say distressed, but maybe concerned with the fact that it wasn't, because I really did strongly for quite a long time feel like there must be something wrong with me.
Tell me a little bit about that. This concern, this fear that you might have something that's wrong, that this was something you were supposed to want. How did that feel? What was the experience of feeling like there was some piece that was missing?
The feeling that there is something wrong with me, for me, begets a lot of shame. And so I think that as much as I was very confident that my own knowing, my intuition, my choices in this area were absolutely right for me, and I was confident that there was no part of me that desired to be a mother, the fact that I had so much kind of messaging coming from the outside that is deviant, that is wrong, you are supposed to want that, created huge cognitive dissonance. And within that, this sense of there's something wrong, there's something missing, something didn't develop correctly in my psyche, maybe even in my bio. And so it was a very strange period of feeling very confident in my choices and in the decisions I was making and in my stance, but that being sort of undermined by this broader kind of pervasive sense of like, what memo did I miss? Like, what did I, and this kind of outsiderish quality, this sort of other, this feeling of being other, you know? Which is very similar. My book previous to this was called Sober Curious. And I write about being a quote unquote normal drinker who decided to stop drinking. And I remember having a very tearful conversation with my mom while she was in the midst of reading this manuscript, and just the kind of realization that so many actually of the choices that have felt deeply right for me have been deemed deviant, strange, unusual, and have sort of placed me in this outsider role. I've spent a lot of my life feeling kind of like an outsider. And so this was one of those experiences. I felt confidently me and also very much the outsider, which comes with its own sort of, slick sort of layer of shame.
It's so interesting you say that for two reasons. One is, I think you could retitle Stork'd, this podcast that explores various family dynamics and the way that we build our families. I think you could retitle it something about shame. What is the shame we feel about families? Because this through line, this thing that all of us experience, regardless of how our families are constructed, it's this shame that's not done the way it's supposed to.
Wow.
Whether we feel we're going through infertility, or whether we adopt, or whether we do it on our own, or choose not to do it. And so when I give presentations, I give it about shame, actually, more so than about. And there's something about this particular topic that feels, for some reason, more shameful than others. Can you help me as you examined this topic, as you've examined choosing to be child-free? Why do you think that is? Why do you think our culture just does not want to accept women who choose not to have?
I think the family unit, in particular, the sort of nuclear family unit that we are supposed to aspire to as the sort of ideal normal, is ultimately the cornerstone of kind of patriarchal society. And so I think anything that deviates from that is subject to a huge amount of projection from the kind of society and the culture at large that we just can't help but absorb. I also think, in my case, I having written this book and really kind of dug into the deep, deep why, I always knew that I came from a fairly dysfunctional family. There's a lot of love individually between my parents, my brother and I. But in terms of the wider family network, there's just not. There's not a lot of closeness. There's not a lot of understanding. There's not a lot of solidarity. There's just a lot of bad feeling, ultimately. And I think there's something, the quality of shame I feel is tied in with this kind of like, I don't fit in because I'm not good enough. There's something distasteful or disgusting even about me. And this sort of sense of being rejected in a way. And I think that anybody who can identify with having had some sort of a dysfunctional family background can possibly relate to elements of that. The fact that it's kind of like pop psychology, right? Like Psychology 101, children kind of believe that any disruptions in the family are due to them. Like they did something wrong. They weren't performing right. They were too this or not this enough, or they weren't good enough for whatever reason. And I think that kind of lingers in a way and sort of can permeate our unconventional family setups, because there's something in us that's like, it's not supposed to look like this. It's supposed to look like something else. And me doing it differently, kind of like, in a way, I'm rejected or estranged from this kind of ideal normal of what a family is supposed to look like. Yeah. It's very complicated, but yeah, it was clinging to me the whole time I was working on the manuscript. As I really kind of allowed myself to feel the feelings of growing up in a family where there was so much just distance and disapproval.
Yeah. And many people grow up in dysfunctional families and choose to have kids.
Yes.
So there was something about your core, your identity, you call it your knowing, that said, it's just still not for me.
Yeah. I think actually I write about this my mother was one of those people. She always wanted to be a mum, but did not wanted to create the almost exact opposite of the family that she grew up in. And this is something that we hear about frequently. I actually believe that women born from the 1960s, 1970s onwards are the first generation of women who have actually had the option to truly reject that. And I think that's one of the reasons we are seeing such rising numbers of women without kids. Yeah. Honestly, I feel like my generation, I was born slap bang in the middle of the 70s, is the first generation who actually truly could say, you know what, I'm not going to repeat that. I'm going to create something different for myself. And I wonder if we'd had things like the advent of the birth control pill, if we'd had things like legalized abortion, if we'd had things like, well, the ERA, which was never ratified, but at least a women's rights movement that allowed women to create our own financial stability and think about, what do I want family to look like versus this is what I do because it's just the only option. We might have seen a drop off in the birth rate and more conversations like this much sooner.
I think
but yeah, I do think that for some people, the path is, and I write about this on a more sort of almost spiritual level. My mom did so much work to do things differently. I feel like she broke so many of the cycles of dysfunction within our little unit, which in a way kind of freed me from having to do that work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't really need to redo anything because she had done that. And I do feel in a way that freed me to really map out a course for my life that was completely in alignment with who I am, regardless of my gender.
Oh my gosh, what a gift Mom gave you that.
Huge. I mean, I write about it that way in the book, and she didn't necessarily see it that way when I was first presented her with the manuscript, but that's ultimately what I'm saying when I describe the dynamics of our relationship. And when I really reflect on what the freedom that I've had to really map a life, like I said, that I feel is completely in alignment with who I am and my capacities, my limitations, like actually really making the choices that are right for me, maybe very, very deviant, maybe very, very divergent from what is expected still. But I'm so grateful to have been able to walk this path. And I would rather walk the path of outsider and be true to myself than pursue a path that meant fitting in and feel like I was cutting parts of myself off to do that.
Okay. Gosh, now that is a lot right there.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
This was just
no.
When I felt such a strong pull to write this book, and I don't really think I realized how big of a subject this was or is until I got into it. And talking about why is there so much shame around this? I think it's because there's so much in the shadows for us around sexual equality, gender equality, harm that has been done to families and women and children, in particular under patriarchal values. There's so much unexamined shadow there. And that's where a lot of the shame lives as well.
Yeah, I think one of my comments to you is you talk about feeling othered, and you talk about feeling like you're walking outside of the constructs of what is normal. And you say, all of my life choices, choosing to be sober, choosing not to have kids, make me so very different. And I understand and appreciate where you're coming from and how that may feel in your heart. And yet, as somebody who has followed your work for some period of time, I see you as somebody who has your finger on the pulse of these huge movements that are going on, these cultural movements, these shifts, these seismic shifts in the way that we behave as women in society. And so to me, rather than being on the outside, you are in the center of some very, very important topics. And it's amazing to me that you've found these things and can articulate them to the world. And it seems like everyone's sort of following in your footsteps. You're sort of pushing the envelope. I'm very curious if you could talk a little bit about what is happening from like a macro movement perspective that enables women to make the choice that you made.
I'll just say one thing about that. Why the outsiderishness is sort of part and parcel of who I am and why I do what I do. I think I have lived a lot of my life from a kind of observer's witness place because of being an outsider, even within my own family. And so that has given me this ability, I think, to observe, kind of like zoom out and observe the bigger trends and sort of notice, oh, we're going here and this is interesting. I don't see myself as a leader so much, more as a guide or
like a scribe almost.
A scribe, like, exactly. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, this insider-outsider perspective of being able to observe and document and therefore enable so many people to make the choices that you made. I mean, when you first came out with Sober Curious, I think you were the first person really writing about people who didn't have a problem with alcohol, but choosing to live a lifestyle that was independent and not codependent on it. And now it's become a huge movement. And in the same way that I think this fear and shame around choosing not to have kids has kept so many people silent about it. We talked about one interview I did with Stork'd where the person even chose not to use her first name, let alone her last name. That level of silence, I'm assuming when your book comes out a couple of years from now, if we were to reconnect, I'm assuming we'd be looking at this and saying, look, there's a huge movement that you found the beginnings of and wrote about so that the rest of us could see that it was happening.
Possibly. It's interesting. So the term movement, to sort of go back to your question about that, my publisher was really keen for me to sort of talk about this as a movement. It's a movement that we're part of, and this is a movement. And the way I think about that is the same way that I think about trends. Like a human evolution has been a series of trends or movements away from one thing towards another thing, right? And so we move in a certain direction collectively. And when I think about this being a movement, I think, you can look back over the past 100 years and see that the birth rate has been dropping steadily, steeply, globally for over a century, right? And will continue to do so at steeper rates going forward. So in terms of this being a movement, when we look at statistics as broad as that, right, then I always think about, well, what are the individual human lives and choices that are leading to a statistic that says that, I can't remember what the specifics are, it's in the book, but it's a certain number of countries globally will have halved their population by the end of this century.
And most of them are first world countries where the economic privilege to do so is available.
Economic privilege, educational privilege, where gender equality is more established. All of these, there's been more progress in all of these different areas that have allowed women to make more choices and have more autonomy about how they want their lives to play out. Choices which sometimes mean sacrificing other things that we would like, but on balance seem like the best choices for us, actually.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, when you look at the different factors that are playing into this movement, these are huge ones, the ones that we've just been talking about. I think the environment is one that's going to become increasingly spoken of in decades to come. Already, Gen Z kind of people that I've spoken to in my research for this book and who've already been kind of like connecting with me about it on social media, concerns about the climate are probably really up there in terms of the choices they're making about their procreative potential. And going back to that thing about any movement, any mass movement is made up of individual people making decisions and choices about how they're living their lives. And I think that this, it's widely reported that the better educated and the more financially independent women are, the fewer children they have.
Yeah.
And so we have people, and partly that's because, yes, they're focusing on careers during their prime child rearing years and then reach a point, well, maybe I can only have one child because I'm not starting my child raising until I'm in my early 40s. Or maybe I don't have any children at all. So that might be a very sad outcome for somebody who wanted that. But it's also part of this movement, right?
Yes.
Movement towards women having more choice. And so making sometimes very difficult, fraught choices about what are the best things for them in terms of how they want to live their lives now. For some of us, that means not having any children, or it means having significantly fewer children, or making families in different ways.
It is so perfect that we're doing this recording the day after the midterm election.
Oh my
and
God.
It's going to come out months later, but any movement has its pushback. And it appears to me that we have this massive seismic pushback against women having choices, women having financial freedom, body autonomy, and against families, really, against the ability to have families in the way that we want, that do not look like the dominant. And the midterms have shown that women are saying, no, this is really important to me to have the choice.
Right.
Do you feel like you want to venture into any political commentary or?
I mean, so I started writing this. I wrote the proposal for this book in 2020. I had the idea for it at the end of 2019. And I suppose some people would say that the writing was kind of on the wall for Roe being overturned as soon as Trump became president. I don't know if I was that tuned into it. I think I was one of the ones who sort of thought, no, this is a progressive Western nation. Like there may be ups and downs, but this right is sanctified here. Like I didn't necessarily see it coming. Some people would probably sound very naive or uber privileged to even be able to have that kind of opinion, but I couldn't have predicted, is what I'm trying to say, that several months before, like literally as I was finishing up the manuscript, Roe would be overturned and we'd be in this position now, which just feels like, what it feels like to me is we've been shot back to the 1970s to redo whatever didn't get done then that needed to be done to really truly cement and sanctify this right for women to have complete freedom and autonomy over how we want to live our lives. And I think that in a way, there's a chance for a redo, and it's painful, and so many people are going to suffer unnecessarily as a result of it. But I do think that any kind of like, for any progress to really stick and to have longevity, these contractions will come up. In some ways, there's an opportunity for us to go, okay, how do we actually really get it right this time? So I don't know.
Optimistic way of looking at it, actually. I like that. Versus like, I've always been thinking it as like a roll back, and you're saying, no, it's an opportunity to redo, reset, reframe.
I mean, it makes me think, you mentioned before we started recording that we're also speaking in the week of this really intense eclipse cycle astrologically. I refrained from putting any astrology in this book. I could probably do a whole other book about the astrology of not having kids, but that's another subject entirely. But I think in astrology, or even if we look at other cycles of nature, we see that like when the planets go retrograde, nature never sort of moves forward, like forward. It's never continual forward motion. There were always kind of like, we always have to fall backwards to almost be reminded of things and relearn lessons and sort of redo things and double check stuff. And I don't know. I suppose I'm just optimistic, again, from this zoomed out perspective of looking at the overall sort of arc of human history. Progress generally wins. Things generally do get better. I guess I just have hope that we're going to we will move forward from this. But in the meantime, it makes this conversation more necessary, I suppose. A book just came out that actually does a brilliant job of reframing the whole abortion issue. It's called Ejaculate Responsibly. I don't know if you've seen it doing the rounds on social media.
I'm writing that down. That's amazing.
It's an amazing title. It's called Ejaculate Responsibly. And she says, we've got it all wrong. Unwanted pregnancy and thus abortion is a men's issue.
Yes.
This is an issue with men being irresponsible with where they put their sperm. We need to re-educate men about how dangerous their sperm is and what a huge responsibility they have for keeping it from where it's not supposed to be. This is something I touch on in Women Without Kids.
Yeah.
But yeah, she really takes that argument and runs with it, which I think is brilliant.
It's
and
brilliant.
This is what I mean. It's like that book, that conversation wouldn't have needed to be started if we hadn't had this sort of like shake of like, hold on, there's more to look at here. Yeah. It's not as simple as just ensuring women's right to abortion. It's actually a much bigger conversation about how we even think about sex education, how we think about reproductive rights, how we think about how we form families, how we think about gender roles in terms of family formation, unwanted pregnancy, etc. It's a much bigger, deeper conversation that still hasn't been fully investigated. And so I think now we're gonna see that conversation very much in the mainstream in a necessary way.
Are you prepared to be your voice, one of the voices of that conversation?
I'm definitely not like put me on a soapbox and let me kind of like preach. I hope that the book can kind of like speak on my behalf in some ways, but I also am appreciative that people will probably want to talk to me about it. It makes me slightly nervous because even mentioning earlier, and it's in the book, but even mentioning here on this recording that I had an abortion when I was 23, I'm nervous about speaking this openly because, there are some people who are very violently opposed to that stance. And it's vulnerable to sort of put yourself out there and advocate for that right, let alone to describe your own experiences with that.
So you started to tell me this, but we kind of got wrapped up in some other questions. Here you are, you're a self-proclaimed introvert. You've made some choices that you believe are from the othered or outside perspective. In writing this book, you become one of the voices of a generation of people that are thinking differently about their choices, and they have the privilege to make those choices. And you might end up being the mouthpiece of a movement. You might end up being the role model for a movement. And when I say that, you literally itch. I literally say you itch. So all this to me seems like you could have said, okay, I've made this very individual choice around my life. That's sufficient. And yet you were compelled to put it in writing. You're compelled to set it into the universe. Can you tell us a little bit about the impetus, the drive to get this message out there?
I mean, this is in my astrology chart too. I'm an Aries sun, pioneer, Aries Mercury, wants to write and propagate new progressive ideas. And I have a Cancer moon, which is like about as deeply introverted as you can get. And I also have Pluto on my midheaven, which is a transformation, a career that's about transformation in some way, shape or form. And I have a challenging chart. And so this is a challenge for me. Like I do have this deep compulsion to kind of expose to the light or bring to the light what I think are big, important conversations. And at the same time, hide under a rock and just live a very private life.
Totally.
It's challenging, but I'm also that's part of my self-acceptance is kind of, I don't know, I guess just giving myself what I need to be able to do that. And just, I am incredibly grateful that I've been in a position, born in a time, into the kind of family I was, into the body that I was, with access to the education that I had and the financial support that I've been able to generate for myself in my life, to be able to be in a position to do what I do. That's like an incredible privilege. And I'm so grateful for that. And this is one, I kind of love podcasts because I feel this feels very intimate and private, right?
Yeah.
And I love one-to-one conversations, but I know that this could be listened to by many people and could be spread far and wide. So this is, I sort of don't like standing on a soapbox, but does this kind of count? Like,
you have to know.
I don't know. Don't put me in front of Congress and put a microphone in my hand, but give me like 50 podcast interviews that can kind of like just spread out into the population and kind of plant seeds in people's consciousness, then I'm happy with that role.
I love that role. It's what makes podcasting so fun, because you get to have the intimacy and you also get to ensure that messages are communicable, they're shared. Okay, let's keep going to the macro for a second, because we've been really heady. We've been really theoretical and conceptual and political. And yet you talk about this wrestling with yourself. For anybody who's reading your book or listening to the podcast, who's wrestling with that cognitive dissonance that you talk about, that sense of, I think I know what I want, but I don't know that it's okay to want this. How did you get to terms with it? Did you go through some sort of spiritual practice? Did you do a lot of journaling? Did you lean into your astrology? How does one wrestle with this stuff?
I mean, truly, it's just about, is this a yes or is this like ultimately like, is this a yes or is this a no? And I write about, there was one time, I think I just turned 38 or just turned 39. And my husband and I throughout the years had kind of like periodically it would come up. Do you want to do this? You're not? No. It would just be like, oh no, I don't know. It doesn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. Like picturing us as parents just didn't feel right. That's the only way I can describe it really. But there was one time when we came really close to being like, you know what? It's probably just fear. It's just fear. It'll be great. Everybody says it's great. Everybody says you never feel ready. And by the way, I also am like, wait a minute. I know lots of people who feel really, 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 really ready to be parents. And that's when they become parents. And that's great. Or they feel really, really ready to become parents and they are unable to have a child. And that's devastating. I'm so grateful that I knew I don't want to be a parent. And I see that as such another privilege in a way, that knowing. But no, there was, because it's so ingrained in our society that this is just what you do and like what you're here to do. And even though it's frightening, it will, the downsides are always massively outweighed by the upsides, and you'll regret it when you're old. That's another huge one that comes up so much. So wrestling with all of that, there was a point, my late 30s, where I just was a bit like, okay, we should just do this. But the thought of actually having unprotected sex was so frightening. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And so my body was just like, no. And then that wave of doubt, that wave of insecurity kind of washed through. And then before I knew it, I was 42, 43 and looking ahead to menopause and finding myself actually feeling quite excited about menopause, which again is another story I write about in the book as to why that was. But within that, finally realizing, oh, there's not a cell in my body that's screaming, you missed your chance, you should have done this.
Yeah.
And that was such huge relief just to go, just to put all of that self-doubt down and say, oh, this has always been my truth. And I think that was really when I decided I wanted to write this book. To, partly be a role model, be one of few role models. I had a hard time finding people who, there have always been a few kind of outliers, like these kind of women without kids, like famous women without kids that we've looked to, people like Oprah Winfrey or like Helen Mirren, just a few, a handful. But I haven't ever heard any of those people really speak about their deepest motivations for not having children, or really examine or unpack all of the different factors that have played into that choice. And that's what I wanted to do with this book, was to really give people the opportunity to reflect on all of the different factors that are impacting how they feel about having children, regardless of whether it's a yes or a no for them. And so that's why in the beginning of the book, I introduced this concept, the motherhood spectrum, where I say, well, what about if we look at this as a spectrum that we might orient on at different places during our lives, depending on our circumstances, but that can be influenced by all kinds of factors, everything from our basic personality to our financial status, to our relationship status, to the desires that we have for ourselves, to our timeline. All these different factors can influence how we feel about it. Yeah, just as a way for people to stay anchored to what is right for them versus what is perceived to be right for them by society and their families. I also feel very fortunate that neither of my parents ever pressured me strongly to have a child or questioned that decision. Friends did. editors in my journalistic career did. I was asked to write about this unorthodox choice many times throughout my 30s. And I was sort of held up as this strange bird. Why doesn't she want children? But yeah, my parents never kind of pressured me or implied that I was letting them down in any way.
And that you and your husband were on the same page.
Yes.
Because so often you enter a marriage in your early 20s and you think eventually. And then there's a turning point where one partner feels one way about where they participate on the spectrum and the other partner feels another way. And that there are some hard trade-offs right there.
Definitely. Again, I'm very fortunate that my husband has felt the same as me and has been supportive of that choice as well. That said, if he had really wanted to be a father with all of his being and had come from a family that I wanted to kind of be more involved with or kind of contribute to in that sort of a way, I possibly would have decided to go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, it might have led to different choices.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
again, it's that
so exactly. I can say I've always been confident that I didn't want to be a mother. But like I said, if he had really wanted that and presented a very solid case for that, this person who I love so deeply and who is my true partner in life, I think it would have been really hard to deny him that or to not get swept up in the excitement of it.
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard. Again, we go back to those trade-offs, the context in which you operate. So you yourself are saying, I'm very clearly resolute in my knowing, and yet had my context been different, I might have made different choices. Yeah. And I think it's important to underscore that, because for anybody listening, taking into account the context they operate in and allowing yourself to make different choices depending on what change evolve, that the spectrum can be different things at different times is really important.
Exactly. Really important. There's a part where I talk about, I think it's only sort of 10% of women without kids are childless by choice. And then about 10% are childless due to infertility. And then about 80% are what's called childless by circumstance. So didn't meet the right person, financially can't afford it, whatever other those circumstances might be. And I kind of asked the question, well, where does choice end and circumstances begin? Because actually every choice that we make shapes our circumstances going forward. Absolutely. And likewise, the circumstances we find ourselves in have profound impacts on our choices. So I kind of think that we're all childless by circumstance in a way.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, one more question. This podcast is all about family, and it's all about our definition of family. And you use family, particularly in your intro, in two different ways. One is you talk about a found family, which is language I haven't seen before. I've mostly seen chosen family. And the second is you write in your inscription, for my family, even as you're writing about choosing not to have a certain type of family. Can you share with us, if you want to make any comment about either one of those, that would be really interesting. And then I'll follow up with my next question.
So in terms of found family and chosen family, I mean, truly, I don't see huge differentiators between those concepts. I think it's the writer in me that likes the alliteration of found family. But I was reflecting on this because this was a question that you sort of sent me in an email before we spoke. And actually, I feel like we don't get to choose our biological family.
Right.
And we do just sort of find ourselves in this, oh, here I am. And oh, this is my family.
Yeah.
And that can be very confronting if for any reason you feel like, and I definitely don't fit in here. Oh, and I kind of like, when I reflect on who I count among my found family, they've all been chance encounters. The person I ended up sharing a desk with in my first magazine job, or the person I ended up in college, we find people, right? And it's not, I've gone through my life saying, oh, and I need someone to fulfill this role. And we find people along the way, hopefully, that we can have these very deep kind of what feel like soul connections with, often very instantaneously. At least it's been that way for me. I sort of know, I write in the book, you know them when you feel them. It's like, these are the people who just sort of feel like home almost instantly. And I haven't sought out to choose them. I've just sort of found them along the way. So that's, I think,
I love it,
why I truly prefer found family. And then in terms of the inscription, that was always what the dedication would be. And I am referring to my biological family in that instance. There are several family members who I didn't really know. Neither of my grandmothers did I have any relationship with. My maternal grandmother died when my mom was 18. My paternal grandmother had mental health issues and was just very absent. And then my aunt and my great aunt on my dad's side both emigrated to Australia, and I didn't know them either. And these were, huge losses for me. And I don't know, I feel like the reason I didn't know these women and they didn't have a place in our family is a result of so many of the things I write about in the book, and absolutely has impacted my own feelings about whether I want to be a mother. And so, it's in that dedication sort of specifically speaks to them, actually. Yeah.
It's so powerful. It's powerful because you're the first person I've mentioned the absence of certain family members has just as profound an impact on your lived experience.
Huge. And because it's like the difference between abuse and neglect. You can't see neglect, and yet it can be as damaging on the psyche. And acknowledging this lack or this absence in my life and feeling the pain of that has been really challenging. But it's helped me to make more sense of why I didn't want to replicate my experience of biological family by continuing that in my life. By dedicating the book to my family, I do think of it as a healing offering for my lineage, a peacemaking and a sense-making, perhaps, for so much stuff that hasn't been spoken about amongst my biological family.
Amazing, because you said your mom did all of the cycle breaking and there was nothing left to break. And yet here is this 2 words that have literally brought you to tears, that have set the context for an entire book, and that you're saying is your way of reconciling and acknowledging something. It's the cycle that is left to break almost.
Yeah. Where it feels like or a full, the kind of the work that my mom did in a way.
Yeah. And I think it's really important because so many naysayers of this movement will say, well, if you choose not to have a kid, you're choosing not to have a family. And it's very important to say, well, we all have families, and they can look and feel different ways. And so by starting a book about choosing not to have kids, by saying for my family, to me, that was like this is a statement. Before any other words are uttered, this is a statement.
Yeah.
Well, so that brings me to the last question. I ask this at every podcast interview, and you have answered this in your book, so I apologize for the redundancy, but can you tell us, what does family mean to you?
I don't know. It's actually, I think, really hard to define. I think, the people that feel like home. These are the people that feel like home. For many years now, before I wrote this book or even started thinking about the concept of found family, I've acknowledged, even just in my own head, that I have kind of collected a troop of what I call my sister friends. I guess I have a Buddhist teacher friend who might call them my spiritual siblings. But these are just people who there's that instant feeler of I'm at home with you. Yeah. To me, that's kind of what family is. And I think I write in the book as well about there are movements definitely towards kind of creating more legal compensations for different kinds. And I'm sure you talk about all this sort of stuff on the podcast all the time, but for different formations and formulations of family on a more practical level.
Yeah.
And one thing I do acknowledge is that I'm uber self-sufficient, and to my detriment. I don't need people. I think that families are formed around shared needs a lot of the time. And it was established that I began sucking my thumb in utero. I began self-soothing before I even came earthside. And I am incredibly self-sufficient and don't need many people. And
some people say that's a trauma response.
Right. I wonder. Right. Yeah.
The extreme self-sufficiency is a response to trauma, and not having a comfort that you will be soothed or supported if you needed to have that from somebody else.
I think there's something in that. I don't know about the trauma word, but I can see that. And I see that in the world at large, in this crisis of connection that we're facing, and this massive increase in single person households. I think there's just a huge talk about trust issues. I think that our society is deeply, deeply untrusting for many reasons. And then we can go back to the political end of the scale, because it's like, well, the institutions that are supposed to be there for us and support us just don't. And so how are we supposed to trust that our needs will be met when, it's so much easier, more convenient and safer to meet our own needs first? And I think that's one of the big things that is decimating family life. So family, it's complex.
And you say that even if you choose not to have kids, right? Which is, it's all so interwoven and so fascinating, right? We talk about the choices that we can make and the choices that are made for us. So Ruby, this conversation, I mean, I literally could go on and on and on. And by the time we finish, we will have literally gone through everything that's written in your book. And that would defeat the purpose of picking it up and reading it. If an audience is compelled by this conversation and wants to read your book or your books, where do we find?
I'm on Instagram. I say it like that because I'm on Instagram intermittently at Ruby Warrington, which that handle has links to my website. I have a Women Without Kids podcast, which I created from all the research interviews for the book. So that's interviews with social scientists and evolutionary biologists and philosophers and all sorts of people whose work kind of informs some of the bigger arguments I make and some of the big picture stuff that I look at. So people who want to dive in deeper that way can take a listen at that as well.
Oh, that's so good. And I highly recommend you do to pick up the book and listen to the podcast. Oh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.